Hi, everybody. My name is Damian Geleyns, and I'm the founder of Legend Life, the host and creator of the Wellness After 40 Summit, the Nutritional Wellness Summit, and the new Happy Mind Summit. Today, I'm going to be sharing a little about myself, a little of my story and struggles with mental wellness as part of an initiative where I'll be sharing the stories of a group of people who have suffered mental illness, trauma, anxiety, which I call the Happy Mind Story series, and who have successfully learned to live with their mental illness, gone on to heal and to thrive, and now are helping others to do the same. My story is a little bit different than the others in that I'm at the very beginning of my healing journey, but I believe in the power of stories and certainly believe there will be some value in some insights you may glean from listening to my story. So if you had asked me some months ago if I'd be sharing a story, I would have certainly said, you must be kidding me. Firstly, because I'm from a generation, a culture. Basically, I'm a rugby playing New Zealander, born of Dutch immigrants who lived through the Depression and World War II, where mental health is certainly something you did not talk about. To admit you were struggling with emotions, felt depressed, sad, lonely, or anything related to your emotions was definitely viewed as a sign of weakness and that you weren't tough enough. So rather you were expected to suck it up and muscle your way through stoically, which is pretty much what I've done most of my life. Only later in life I realized this is completely misguided and this is certainly not something we should be doing if we're intending to show up in the world fully. Basically, in my generation, if you were to admit you had mental illness or needed the assistance of a therapist, you were ostensibly saying you were a broken human and it was something you definitely needed to be ashamed of. So the world has certainly changed since this particular point of time, and also it's become more commonplace for us to talk about mental illness, and it's something that needs to be talked about, and is part of the reason behind the Happy Mind Summit. Secondly, the other reason why I didn't think I'd be sharing this story with you was because basically I didn't think that I had any issues with my mental wellness. Like I didn't think that any of the events that happened to me throughout my life, or more importantly through my childhood, had it actually impacted me or created a way that I showed up in the world that was perhaps suboptimal, and that perhaps I had developed some patterns or behaviors that were maladaptive and could be actually limiting how I show up in the world. But after basically working on this project, the Happy Mind Summit project, I've had the benefit of interviewing over 70 wellness experts, healers, and therapists, plus the people I've mentioned who will be sharing their story, as well as gathering information from a whole range of different experts and influencers in the mental wellness industry. I certainly became more aware that mental health is critical for how we show up in life, and that quite possibly it was a reason why I was living life the way I was living it and then wasn't feeling very fulfilled, happy, or satisfied with my life. So let me share a little bit about my story. So as I mentioned, I was born of Dutch immigrants who immigrated to New Zealand right after the war, World War II. They actually met in New Zealand and then basically got married in New Zealand before having myself and my sister. So both parents are completely different people. My father is very stoic, driven, or was a very stoic, driven, harsh man who didn't tolerate weakness, didn't tolerate softness, and then basically muscled his way through life. On the other side, my mother was a very gentle, caring, loving kind of person. So it's true, opposites do attract. So my early childhood up to 4 was pretty much uneventful. Nothing really different kind of occurred. But age 5, a number of events were quite kind of like dramatic for me. And only more recently have I realized that they perhaps could have had an impact on how I'm showing up currently. So specifically at the age of 5, I began school, so like we all do. But at this particular point in time, I did not actually speak English because my parents were Dutch and we spoke Dutch at home. So I showed up at school, didn't speak a word of English, and then certainly felt a little bit disconnected and isolated from everyone else and quite different. About 3 or 4 months into the year, another event occurred. We were going to school and we had a car accident. So not quite sure what exactly happened. I believe the axle or some part of the wheel mechanism broke, and it ended up with us like hitting a lamppost actually landing on the car. So this was a time where you didn't actually have requirement to wear seatbelts, and then I was in the passenger side of the seat. So whilst my sister and my mother were unharmed, I actually was required to be cut out of the car with a part of the car in my head and another part of the car through my bottom part of my leg. So all my memories are of this have been cut out of a car by firemen and then being taken to hospital and then spending a bit of time recovering before going back to school. Later in that year, another kind of like traumatic family event. Actually, a cousin of mine who was exactly the same age, and to be honest, at that time was kind of like my best friend, actually died in an accident. So obviously there was some grief in the family, and I certainly don't really understand now how we kind of like dealt with it or how it was kind of explained to me, but certainly do believe it may have had some impact on me, because from 5 onwards, suddenly I started having issues with my weight. I started eating, and later on in life, I guess, I was using food as some kind of like comfort to kind of like deal with the challenges of number one, or the trauma of number one, the car accident, and then losing who at that time was my best friend. So basically, this led to a range of other issues, like obviously, as I kind of indicated, I already had started school feeling I was different, that I didn't really fit in because of the language issue. And then now suddenly I was an overweight kid who then became subject to the bullying that normally kind of like happens for those who don't fit in the sense that they don't look the same as the rest of us. So this kind of like went on to about 11. So I felt quite isolated, quite lonely, and certainly not, part of the school community. And in fact, I used to go home for lunch because I didn't really want to be at school, because all that was kind of like happening at school at the time was people calling me names. My surname is Geleyns, and they used to call me Jelly Belly. So, basically the usual realities of, kind of like children picking on other children. So, but then my life kind of like took another turn when I was 11. So myself and my mother on a wet, rainy day, wet, rainy Christchurch day, were rushing off to get me to the dentist. And then on this particular day, we were extremely late. And so we were kind of like running along the road. And then we went to cross a road. I kind of like pulled back, my mother went ahead, and then she was run over by a car. So I don't remember all the kind of like details. Obviously it was quite dramatic. Basically my mother kind of like shattered both legs, spent the next period of time Like I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks. She was like in intensive care, kind of like fighting for her life. So obviously this was quite traumatic for myself, but I guess the most traumatic part of this kind of like event, apart from actually seeing this all unfold before my eyes, was the fact that later in the day I was at the hospital, obviously quite emotional, crying, all the rest, and then family relatives came along and basically told me to stop crying and to man up. So basically, at this particular point of time, I made a decision that I would no longer ever let anyone see me show what I then perceived to be a sign of weakness, or that I would ever again cry. So I guess this was quite traumatic for me, because it's actually led me to be a person who does have a lot of difficulties in actually showing his emotions. But once again, as you do when you're a kid, you kind of like lock that away, and you don't really kind of like realize that it may be shaping how you kind of like show up in the world. So life continued. Basically, I was kind of like farmed off to relatives who I actually didn't really like, and felt they didn't really like me, because I'd already spent most of my life up to the point of 11 pointing out to my mother and my father all my flaws, including the fact that I was overweight. So after spending a bit of time here, I actually ran away, found my way back across town to home on one weekend. My father came home, obviously quite exasperated. What was I doing? And I basically clearly explained to him and said to him that I was not going to go back to my relatives. You could do whatever you wanted to me. And I was just going to stay home. So obviously that resulted in hiding. And then something I failed to mention is that my father is quite a easily angered, aggressive kind of like guy, special forces, boxer, hunter. And he was certainly a very tough kind of like, as I was growing up, being the youngest son, I bore the brunt of that, and was certainly expected to kind of like man up, show up, basically be responsible. And that was usually kind of like, enforced with some kind of like physical kind of like beating or something similar. So I won't go violence, because actually later in life, that's what it kind of like escalated to. At that time, it was just like severe kind of like hidings. So he did give me a hiding, but I said, you can do this as long as you want, but I'm definitely not going back to these relatives. So he basically gave in. And then for the rest of that year, I spent time at home. My father kind of like spent his time working. So he used to like leave home at 6, then come home at 10. And then in between this time, he was obviously spending time with my mother. So I basically grew up with neighbors who kind of like gave me lunch and then also dinner. And then pretty much for, the remainder of I think it was 1981, I spent taking care of myself, and basically coped with what I experienced by focusing on my studies. I actually became dux of my class in that year, and then also playing soccer. I became like the top player of soccer. So my coping mechanism at that time was to focus on other things to distract me from what I'd experienced. So throughout this time, my mother was in recovery, and then used to come home periodically on weekends, but she was obviously quite incapacitated. And it wasn't until fully in 1982, when I was 12 years old, that she was actually able to come home on a full-time basis. So by this time, I'd spent like over 6, 7 months taking care of myself and basically doing what I wanted to do. And then suddenly here was my mother trying to get back into my life, which led to me having adverse reactions, being angry, flying off the handle, breaking things, punching holes in walls, etc. So a whole range of things that I didn't really understand and the reason why I was getting so kind of like angry. But it seems from later in life, understanding that basically my nervous system was kind of like dysregulated, and then basically it was a way to kind of like stop myself feeling, and then also exerting some kind of control. What it was, I'm not completely clear of, and I guess it's not really relevant to kind of like dive into it. Um, but the net result of this kind of like activities was, as you remember, a very disciplinary father. Person doesn't accept you not, manning up, taking responsibility. So it meant that my father, after a long day of work, would come home around about 10 o'clock at night, drag me out of bed, and basically give me a hiding. So most of that particular period of my time was barricading my door, kind of like trying to sleep, but knowing that I'd be dragged out of bed and given a beating. So this went on till I was about 13. Then the actual confrontations between my father kind of like escalated, where I actually would break away after he was giving me a hiding, and kind of like set myself up with all kind of resources to kind of like defend myself, and then actually taunt him to come and give me a hiding. And then it would lead into kind of like almost like a war zone, with me kind of like trying to beat him with broomsticks, pull cues, throw pull cues at him, whilst he actually until he actually gave me a hiding, and then I went into some form of submission. So these kind of like battles became quite frequent, and then the being part of this religious community, a Catholic kind of like church and a Catholic kind of school, the school became involved, and then kind of like suggested that I needed to kind of go to some kind of therapy, some kind of group counseling to kind of hopefully help me address what were my anger issues. So then I was, half a day of school for most of my first part of 1983. So when I was like 13, so the first year in high school was spent going to therapy sessions with not other children, but adults. So people who had tried to commit suicide, people who were dealing with depression, people who had, were, dealing with all forms of kind of addictions. So here is I, 13-year-old, sitting listening to all these stories, not willing to share my own story and not really understanding why I was here. Whilst at home, the, the actual kind of like events with my father were escalating and getting worse. And then it actually became a case where social welfare became involved, and even the police. So eventually, one day I found myself in a children's court, with a judge telling me that apparently these therapists who I'd been seeing as part of these group counselling sessions had determined that I had violent tendencies, antisocial behaviour, and was a danger to my parents and should be put in an institution. So basically, one day I rocked up at court, and the next day I found myself in a juvenile detention centre. So for the next 5 months of my first year of high school. So juvenile detention centre is filled with, in this particular case for myself, were kids who were involved in robberies, were members of or part of or younger members of gangs in New Zealand. There were kids who were in there for running away from home, people who were living on the streets. So it was a wild world. It was kind of a really wild kind of like environment. Very much like a prison. You have solitary confinement. When you get in there, you're like subjected to a beating, but to kind of like test you out to see how strong you were, etc. Blah blah blah. So it was kind of like quite a traumatic event. Previously I'd been a top student. apart from struggling at home. And then basically now I'd kind of been labeled a misfit, broken kid who was violent and wasn't even someone who could spend time in his own home and was a danger to himself and to others. So that was my rest of my teenage years. Then back to home. By this time, most of my extended family, so uncles, etc., I was viewed as a troubled child. They didn't want to bring their kids to our home because they didn't want to be exposed to this broken person. So it further led to isolation. Obviously, at school, I still had issues with my weight, but I was also known as the kid who had needed therapy. So this is a Catholic all-boys school. So I was considered like completely broken, crazy kind of individual. And then on top of that, I had gone to a juvenile detention center. And so obviously not many friends age 14 or for that matter, age 15. So about this time, nothing really changed at home. The beatings kind of like continued. Myself and my father continued to have issues and challenges, which kind of like escalated to one day. He came after me and then I lashed out. Now, age 15, I was quite big for my age. And then actually I didn't realize what I'd actually done because basically, you know, I'd usually do the similar kind of like activity. I'd fight back and then break away, run away, and then kind of like wait to get the beating. So basically went in submission. But in this particular case, my father didn't pursue me, didn't come after me. And it was only later I kind of like discovered that in lashing out, I'd actually broken bones in his cheek. So am I proud of that event? No, I'm not. But the one thing that did change at that particular point of time is that that was the very last time my father, who several times through my childhood had kind of like indicated to me. So my father was boxer, special forces, hunter guy, so really tough kind of guy who used to tell me that he could kill me with his pinky. Suddenly decided that what he was doing was no longer effective. And as I indicated, that was the last time me and my father ever came to blow, but it certainly had caused a rift in our relationship where we didn't really speak much to each other throughout the rest of like the time I spent in New Zealand, leaving New Zealand in 90 when I was 23. So which is now, you know, over 30 years ago. So, you know, since that time, I've kind of like, you know, forgiven my father because I understood that he also had traumas in his life, and then he certainly just didn't have the resources to kind of deal with a kid who was also had trauma, you know, through the experiences he had. So I certainly forgive my father. And we, you know, later before he died, I spent a bit of time trying to spend some time with him, you know, and try to kind of like repair the relationship we did have. So back to 15. So nothing eventful happened after that. Basically, around 14s and 15s, I kind of like found fitness. I basically made a decision. I didn't want to be a fat person anymore. Also found sport, and then became quite successful and found that actually my aggressive kind of like tendencies actually had a good outlet when I was playing rugby. You know, because basically my coping strategy from 14 onwards, dealing with life, dealing with my aggressiveness, was to actually just wear myself out. So I would go for long bike rides, 4 or 5 hours in the hill country around Christchurch. I would play basketball for hours on end. I would do all kinds of activity. I bought my own gym equipment, did odd jobs to pay for gym equipment because I was still embarrassed about how I looked. So I used to train at home, and then basically kind of like changed the way I was, and then became an athlete, and then quite successful at that. Then looking back at this particular point of time, I didn't actually address any of the things that happened to me. And then I just thought this was normal, that other kids had lived similar kinds of experiences, and that, there was nothing different with myself, and that I just needed to kind of like muscle my way through life. And I pretty much did that. So as I mentioned, from there, I used the skills I had in rugby to take me overseas. So then I left New Zealand and then moved to the US, and where I played rugby for a number of years. Then back to Australia, where I could, I actually did go to university. So aggressive, violent kid who apparently was antisocial, and then and a write-off. Like basically all my relatives said I was a write-off. Managed to complete a law degree, then excelled at rugby, representative level. Traveled overseas where I played rugby in the US, and then after an injury where I broke both bones of my forearm, decided that I actually needed to kind of like go back to using my brain rather than my brawn, and actually completed a master's in Australia, then use this to go on, work in a law firm, work in consulting, and then a whole range of different activities, including multiple entrepreneurial activities, which has seen me move to 5 or 6 different countries, live in different places around the world, conduct business internationally, have had successful businesses that have failed, until my late 40s, that saw me actually living in Brazil. So looking back, I didn't pay much attention to what had kind of like occurred in my life, and just assumed these were things that had happened, and they had no real impact upon me. By this time, I'd been an entrepreneur for about 20 years. I had pretty much been a workaholic. So basically, as I indicated earlier, my coping strategy early on was like physical exercise. I still continued that interest in physical exercise, but also later in life, it became a bit of a workaholic. So I didn't really know how to enjoy myself. Pretty much worked all the time, 12, 14, 16-hour days, weekends worked as well, and continued that kind of like a rhythm right up into my 40s, until one day, in a heated discussion with a staff member, I suddenly began slurring my words. I started feeling numb on the left side of my body, and then I collapsed and waking up 20 minutes later. And then the diagnosis was stress-induced transitory stroke. So basically, even though I was physically fit, apparently sleeping 4 hours a night, working all the time, not really relaxing or enjoying yourself is counterproductive to your health. So that led me rethinking a little bit, because at this particular point in time, I also had, I think my son was about 4 or 5 years old, and started me asking myself some questions about whether or not I was really showing up in life. So asking the question, but did I actually do anything different? No, I continued for another 6 months, until another episode where I woke up one Monday morning, looked over, and there was a girlfriend who I'd broken up with, or actually I had been in quite a serious relationship, and she had been living with me, but we actually broke up, and we went our separate ways. And then she was actually there with me, and then I was quite surprised, and asked her what kind of like occurred. And then at this point in time, I need to reference I don't do drugs and I don't drink. And then I couldn't remember a whole week, and she'd actually been back with me for a week. And then myself, herself, and her kids, her son and my son would actually spent the whole weekend together, and I couldn't remember any of it. So then I, went to visit a number of neurosurgeons, etc., trying to explain what happened to a whole week of my life. And then basically the end diagnosis was basically that I had some kind of like stress-induced amnesia. So these events kind of like made me kind of like go, what was happening in my life? Like, what was really going on? Why, like here, I'm a physically fit kind of like guy. I'm not unsuccessful. And then why is it I'm having these kind of like events? And so it led to a bit of soul searching and asking, what was I doing with my life? And then, was I really happy with my life? And the answer, after much deep question, was no, I wasn't actually really happy with my life. And then the second question was, do you know how to be happy? And then the answer was, no, I don't know how to be happy. And the third question I had was, do you think you can be and deserve to be happy? And then this other question was also an unequivocal no. So basically here I am, ostensibly successful. So if anyone who knew me was asked the question, do you think Damian is successful, productive, healthy kind of individual, they would say yes, like he's definitely does. He's he's productive, he's been successful, he's had successful businesses, he's, even though there have been some failures in there, he's on the whole looks to be successful. He's lived in multiple countries, he's done lots of adventurous activities, he's traveled to over 20 countries around the world, he's conducted business in multiple places, Africa, Asia, India, China, etc. So, he's definitely thriving. He's like really going on. But personally, I was going, I'm not happy with my life. Like I feel lonely. I couldn't really come to grips with like why I've never been in a really long-term relationship. Like age 53 now, I've never been married. The longest relationships I've had have lasted to about a year before basically I end up breaking them up. I kind of like don't continue. I find it difficult to form relationships with friends. Like I have acquaintances, but I haven't really developed very deep relationships with other people. Why have I had lots of successes, but I've also had lots of failures? So often when I'm very successful, what I would do, suddenly I'm getting comfortable, I would actually go, this is not good enough, I'm not good enough, this is not going to like continue. And then I'd develop a new business activity which would make me work even harder. So even though I was being successful, I'd then like create this need to do something else because it wasn't enough. And then, like invariably that business would fail or like harm the business that was actually funding that business. And then I'd have to kind of like start from scratch again and try and once again muscle up, once again, be more disciplined, work harder. That was kind of like my coping strategy with everything in life. So all of these questions started coming up. And then these are the reason I actually started Legend Life, because I was going, there must be a better way of living your life. Like, I'm not happy, I'm not fulfilled. I work really hard, but I'm not really successful. I'm also not really happy with my life. And why is that? So then I kind of like went on a bit of a mission of kind of trying to understand what it takes to live your best life. So I interviewed a number of different people, like over 100 people I've kind of like interviewed, like adventurers, travelers, entrepreneurs, etc., who have been successful in life and certainly appear and from what I've heard from them, are certainly living like what for them is their best lives. Along the way, I decided that wellness was a vehicle for actually enabling you to live a legend life. And it kind of like led me down the path of doing the summits I have, such as the Wellness After 40 Summit and the Nutritional Wellness Summit. So, but all the time in the back of my head, I was looking for answers and trying to understand why I wasn't happy and what it took to be happy. And I really didn't have any answers. I really didn't understand why I was really struggling, why I was lonely all the time, why I felt depressed a lot of times, why I would overreact to simple things and get very angry, or for no reason at all, I'd be feeling very emotional, and then actually have my eyes tearing up for no explicit kind of like reasons. And I didn't really invest much energy in trying to find the answers apart from going, work harder, tough up, get through this. And then looking, as I said, externally, what maybe was missing in my life. So these summits kind of like used to provide me with a lot of like feedback from different people. And then some of the things that were coming up were people were having concerns with anxiety and depression, and then also dealing with stress. So that's the reason I decided to create the Happy Mind Summit. So I thought this would be a very small summit. Basically, I'm doing this to kind of like help these people who seem to have a need. So, my idea was a small summit, 25 interviews, and I thought, well, maybe there's some information that could be beneficial for myself, but primarily my objective was to help the people who had kind of expressed they were like struggling. But as I started these interviews, it really became clear to me that mental wellness was not just like dealing with like mental illness, wasn't dealing with just like depression, anxiety, or trauma or stress. It was actually important for your overall wellness. It had ramifications for your physical health, and it also had ramifications for how you showed up in life, and then whether or not you were really living your best life. So then I became more curious, and then I wanted to know more answers and really kind of like really understand what impact our mental health did. So I started broadening the amount of people I was kind of like interviewing. So suddenly it's kind of like ballooned, where there will be like, I've actually conducted 73 interviews. I've interviewed 73 interviews with mental health experts, therapists, and healers. I've interviewed 8 people who have experienced mental illness and come out the other side stronger, better, and now thriving, and also helping other people. I reached out to mental health influencers to get their answers to what their definition of mental wellness was, what happiness meant to them, and what a happy mind also meant to them. So, I have had lots and lots of information. And then it really became clear to me how important mental wellness was. But the biggest thing that I kind of uncovered was that perhaps the reason why I wasn't happy with life, the reason I didn't feel fulfilled, the reason I wasn't satisfied, the reason I didn't think I could enjoy life was in fact that perhaps my childhood had actually had an impact upon me, that perhaps the events that had occurred to me and my failure to kind of address them, heal from them, had actually influenced how I showed up in life, had actually perhaps led me to develop some maladaptive coping mechanisms which may have served me well when fighting off my father, helped me deal with the fact of what I experienced in the car accident, helped me deal with the fact that my best friend had died, my cousin, my best friend had died, helped me deal with the fact that I just saw my mother get run over by the car, and blaming myself that perhaps I was at fault because I'd pulled back and didn't get hit by the car, but she did. Feeling also that my father blamed me for what happened to my mother, and perhaps was the reason why, the disciplining kind of like escalated into real kind of like physical violence. So all of these things, so it suddenly kind of dawned on me that perhaps they had impacted me. And then some of the conversations I was having with therapists about adverse childhood experiences, about the impact of childhood trauma on people going forward, in their lives, and actually impacting how they're showing up. So they weren't actually showing up to their full potential. They weren't really showing up their full authentic selves, made me realize that perhaps that was my story. So not to kind of like look at my past and go, oh, so sorry, me, because this is certainly not who I am. There's no way in the world that I would ever look for kind of like sympathy, but more in the realization that events in your past can influence how you show up in the world at this particular point in time, and that you need to take responsibility for addressing what has occurred so that you can fully show up. That you need to, number one, cultivate the awareness to kind of like understand, am I showing up as my true authentic self? Am I showing up being my best version of myself? And if the answer is no to any of those questions, if there is a sense that something's missing, that you really need to ask why, and then start investigating and unpeeling what may be the reasons you are the way you are. In my case, why is it I struggle with relationships, both intimate and personal? Why is it that I feel driven to always work, or feel I'm busy and feel uncomfortable to relax or have any kind of like downtime? Why is it that I choose to do high risk activities, like, even when I'm successful, just leave a country when everything's comfortable, just leave a country, drop everything, move to somewhere else where I don't know anyone, and start all over again? Why do I start new businesses even when I am being successful in one, and then invariably go invest my energies in a new one, which basically invariably implodes and then drags down the others, costing me a large amount of money and sending me back to starting from scratch? So the end result is that I need to address what has happened in the past. And through kind of like interviewing all these people, I've kind of realized, number one, that there has been an impact. Number two, that you can heal with it, and you don't need to go all the way back to the past to kind of like deal with it. And that there are lots of tools, practices, and resources available that can help you show up in the world a better version of yourself. And then actually thriving and flourishing in life is actually possible. That I personally can be happy, that I can go on to live a happy, flourishing life, that I don't have to kind of like struggle the way that I'm currently struggling. So looking back at my past, you may all be going, well, that's all negative. And then I would go, no, it's not negative, because it actually has shaped who I am. It's enabled me to show up in life and weather multiple challenges, like breaking arms, torn knee ligaments, broken thumb, hot clavicle, all, potentially threatening what was then a flourishing career in rugby, but basically working back and getting back to where I started. It's helped me start $50,000 in debt and then build a business that was making, close to $3 million a year, like by myself, no one else. It's helped me recover from losing close to $1 million and of my own money, and then over 250,000 of investors' money in another failed business. It's helped me show up to be a father. So I can tell you that being a father was the last thing I thought I would be in my life. I thought that I wouldn't have the capacity to be a good father. I would be exactly the same as my father and then basically rain havoc on my son. So I made a commitment to myself that I would never be a father. But life gives you gifts. And this particular gift was the opportunity to be a loving, caring person, which I didn't think was possible. So it wasn't planned. And in life, and the gifts you get given are not often planned. And it actually came at a very challenging time, because it was actually the day that I was laying off 10 people who were working with me, closing down a business that had, as I mentioned, lost me close to $1 million and 250,000 in investors. And then a woman I'd had a relationship with basically came to my office just as I had cleared the office of all my staff, and then point blankly advised me that I was about to be a father. So a highly triggered person that I am, naturally not very good at emotional regulation. I was very angry and said a lot of things that I regret at this particular point in time. But that was the fact. I was about to be a father. So in a pretty low moment of my life where I was feeling like a failure, a loser, someone, who didn't really deserve to be here, suddenly I was presented with this responsibility of another human. I actually had to kind of like front up and make sure I could recover myself to kind of provide for my son. So, it hasn't been easy. It certainly wasn't easy come to terms with it, but certainly it has been something that's kind of like shown me that who sometimes we identify ourselves as being could be further from the truth if we've give ourselves the opportunity. So am I the same as my father? No. Do I sometimes find myself getting bent out of shape and then struggle with how I respond to my son? Yes. But am I anything like what I experienced? Am I setting him up in a completely different way than I was set up for life? And the answer is yes. So we do have the ability to kind of like change. So I kind of just wanted to reference that regardless of what you experience in life, the challenges, the hardships, the trauma, the grief, the loss, you can deal with it. And these kind of like shape you. But what we have to, on the flip side of this, is to actually understand that unless we embrace the emotions and the feelings we're having and learn to deal with them, that they potentially could lead us to forming behaviors and coping strategies that may inhibit our ability to be who we would like to be and live the lives we would like to live. So I'm going to finish here. So hopefully my story has at least provided you with a perspective of the importance of mental health in our lives. I'm hoping for those of you who, especially my generation, who have not faced their past, have kind of come to realize that impact that has had on them, and perhaps that it perhaps has kind of like shaped how you're showing up in the world. And then lastly, that even at the age of 53, that I have hope, that I believe that I can address and change the way that I show up in the world, that I do have the possibility of living my best life, to being happy with my life, to being satisfied and filled with my life, and that it's my responsibility now to kind of like seek the help I need to learn more about the tools and practices that can help me become a better person, so I can show up to be a better father. I can actually go off into the world and make the contribution that I would like to make, and then also have a positive impact on others. And this is pretty much why I do the work I do, the reason why I host these summits, the reason why the Happy Mind Summit is kind of like ballooned into this kind of like very huge event, because I understand that we all need or have this desire to be the best we can be, to show up in the world the way we want, our authentic selves, our best selves, and that we all do have a purpose, and that we all have something to contribute, and that we can't do this if we're struggling. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you all. So my last message to you is, understand that we all deserve a happy mind, and that if we choose to do what's required to cultivate proactively each and every day our happy mind, that we will have a happy life. And then from us having a happy life, we will go on to create a happier world and planet. So one more time, thank you for being part of my community, and I hope my story resonates with you. And I look forward to sharing the Happy Minds Summit, and then also the stories of others who have recovered from mental illness and are now thriving and sharing their stories and experiences with the world. Thank you.